The present-day Kansas City Southern is one of America's mega railroads. While not as big as the Union Pacific or the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, as shown on this map, the KCS traverses a vast territory, including 11 American states, and as a major NAFTA carrier, owns over 1,000 miles of former Mexican rail from Laredo, Texas to Mexico City and throughout central Mexico. The Kansas City Southern was not always such a large railroad. In the middle years of the last century, before the impact of NAFTA, the KCS was a 2,500-mile railroad located in Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. Kansas City Southern main lines connected the major urban areas of the lower Midwest and southern sections of the country, including Kansas City, Dallas, Port Arthur, and Beaumont, Texas, and Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. Looking at a schematic drawing of the KCS in the 1960s, it is clear that it was basically a north-south railroad running between Kansas City and the Gulf cities of Port Arthur and New Orleans, with a western branch to Dallas, Texas. The history of the Kansas City Southern is, like most railroads, a complicated story. It involves a 122-year history of politics, construction, lease, and purchase. However, it can be basically understood as being the result of the building and joining together of three railroads. The first was the Kansas City Suburban Belt Railroad. The second was the Kansas City, Nevada, and Fort Smith, later to become the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf Railroad, and the third, the Louisiana and Arkansas Railroad. In 1887, a charter was granted for the construction of a switching, industrial, and terminal railroad in and around Kansas City. Named the Kansas City Suburban Belt Railroad, it began operations 3 years later in 1890. Ideally located in the evolving industrial areas of the city, the KCSB connected the industrial and meatpacking areas between Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. In 1889, the same group that built the Suburban Belt Railroad around Kansas City incorporated the Kansas City, Nevada, and Fort Smith Railroad. The goal was to build a railroad approximately 80 miles southeast out of Kansas City to the coal fields surrounding Hume, Missouri, and the lead and zinc mines near the town of Joplin. The KCN and FS would provide direct access from the mining areas to Kansas City through interchange with the Suburban Belt. It took 3 years to complete the project. Almost as quickly as it began operation, the Kansas City, Nevada, and Fort Smith was reorganized as the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf. The change in the name reflecting the proposal to develop a rail connection between Kansas City and the Gulf of Mexico. The decision was made to develop a new port city, to be named Port Arthur, rather than connect the line to New Orleans or another existing city. A site along the Louisiana Gulf Coast with a barrier island was selected as the location for Port Arthur. It was thought that this barrier island would provide hurricane protection for the future port. Port Arthur was developed into a deep water port with piers, warehouses, and elevators. The Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf was completed when the final spike was driven near Beaumont, Texas on September 11, 1897. 3 years later, the KCP&G was reorganized into the Kansas City Southern Railroad. The third of the three building block railroads was the Louisiana and Arkansas. The Louisiana and Arkansas Railroad was chartered on March 18, 1898. It had its beginnings as a timber line near the small town of Stamps, Arkansas. The railroad continued to expand through construction, lease, and purchase to include New Orleans, Louisiana by 1928 and Dallas, Texas by 1932. The Louisiana and Arkansas became part of the Kansas City Southern System on June 30, 1939. The future of Port Arthur, as well as the new Kansas City Southern Railroad, were greatly enhanced by the discovery of oil near Beaumont, Texas, in 1901. Port Arthur grew into one of the largest port cities on the Gulf of Mexico. When the main line to Port Arthur was completed in 1897, the KCS was primarily a railroad that moved freight south to the Gulf port, but ran light on return trips north. However, with the evolution of the petroleum and petrochemical industry in and around Port Arthur, the KCS benefited from a balanced freight movement. Bulk and manufactured goods moved south, and imported products and the petrochemical oil-related movements headed north to the inland cities. The Kansas City Southern was an early proponent of dieselization. Its experience with electromotive passenger and switching locomotives, acquired in the late 1930s before World War II, had been positive. As soon as the war restrictions on the construction of diesel locomotives were lifted, it began ordering diesels, moving as quickly as possible towards the elimination of steam power. F3 cab-type over-the-road freight engines, known by rail fans as covered wagons, were purchased from EMD and began joining the roster in 1947. The KCS continued to purchase cab units. EMD's upgraded F7s followed in 1949. Cab units were also purchased from Fairbanks Morris, the first delivered in 1946 and the last of 8 purchased in 1947. The last EMD F7s were delivered in 1951 and were the final covered wagons added to the roster. Kansas City Southern's first road switchers were 4 Alco RS1s delivered in 1943. The Alcos and 2 H1544s from Fairbanks Morris, acquired in 1949, were the only non-EMD road switchers on the KCS roster. The first of a long line of electromotive road switchers were 5 GP7s delivered in 1951. The KCS continued to purchase electromotive road switchers throughout the later years of the last century. The KCS, like many railroads, especially those dealing with steep grades, found an advantage to the higher horsepower single units. It was more economical to run 3 or 4 second-generation diesels than it was a string of 5, 6, or even 7 of the early first-generation cabs or jeeps. The goal of this DVD is to turn back the clock and explore the diesel roster of the Kansas City Southern as it was in those middle years of the last century, standing trackside along the mains and in the yards and terminals, looking at those early diesels as they haul the freights and pull the passenger trains. We will begin our review of the Kansas City Southern diesel roster with locomotives assigned to over-the-road freight service. The Kansas City Southern between 1945 and 1985 had a total of 305 diesel locomotives assigned to over-the-road freight service. 294 came from Electromotive and 11 from Fairbanks Morris. There were 88 cab types and 217 road switchers. Obviously, not all were on the roster at the same time. As will be identified, a number of the earliest first-generation units, however, were still in revenue service in 1985. We will begin our review of over-the-road freight units with those constructed by Electromotive, beginning with the F3 and ending with the SD50. Electromotive F-Series cab units were the backbone of the KCS first-generation over-the-road freight power. Between 1947 and 1951, 79 F-type cab units joined the roster, 44 F3s and 35 F7s. The F units were ordered in AB sets without front-end multiple control capability. As a result, early KCS diesel-powered freights tended to be headed by ABBA lash-ups, considered by many rail fans to be the classic form of diesel utilization. Eventually, all of the A units were retrofitted with MU capability, and the Fs were used in combinations as necessary. During the late 1950s and into the 60s, it was common to see 5, 6, or even 7 units heading freights over the heavily graded sections of the KCS. The 6 F3s and 17 F7s remaining on the roster in 1977 were renumbered with 4-digit road numbers in the 4000 series and given the White Knight paint scheme. The final F3 on the roster, number 4050, delivered as number 30 and operating as a slug, remained on the roster until 1988. In April of '89, it was sold to the Central California Railroad Museum and is now part of their permanent display. The KCS is thought to be the last Class I railroad to operate F units in regular service. It became a favorite of rail fans and a magnet for lovers of first-generation covered wagons. In this August of 1980 photograph, we see F3 number 4051 in Shreveport, Louisiana, wearing the White Knight paint scheme. In this 1967 movie clip, we see a classic ABBA lash-up, an F7 leading 3 F3s through Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and across the Mississippi River. The KCS fleet of 35 F7s joined the roster between 1948 and 1951. There were a number of unusual F7s among the group. Number 32A, 32B, and 33A were identified as the first set of F7s assembled by EMD. Number 59A was also an unusual locomotive. It was EMD's prototype test unit for the F7 series and originally identified as an F5. It was rebuilt and delivered as an F7 in 1948. The last F7 on the roster was number 4054, delivered as number 86. It remained in service until October of 1988. In April of the following year, it was sold with the F3 to the Central California Railroad Museum. F7 number 70 wore a variation of the blonde paint scheme when it laid over in Hope, Arkansas in this July of 1977 photograph. Number 4053 is former F3 number 58D. Note the far grille it received when it was rebuilt as an F9 in 1956. In this photograph, it is seen at Shreveport during June of 1981. During a visit to the Shreveport shops, we had an opportunity to get an up-close photograph of the rather unusual striped handrails that were common on the Kansas City Southern F units. In this June of 1981 photograph, we see F7 number 4063 laying over in Hope, Arkansas. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the Kansas City Southern rebuilt the remaining F units. A number were rebuilt to slugs. Several of these slugs were assigned to units hauling coal from Thermo, Texas, to a power plant near Mount Pleasant. In these next two photographs, we see F7 number 4059 sitting on the ready track with a series of slug units. In this December of 1967 photograph, we see F7 number 87 leading a 4-unit lash-up as it approaches the freight yard in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Number 4056, a former F7 rebuilt into a slug, is coupled between two new GP40-2s. The trio is working the Lake Charles Beaumont local in the late 1980s. Note that number 4056 wears the new paint scheme. It has the large KCS letters on the side, and on the front it has a nose herald. This movie clip taken in July of 1967, we see number 70 and two sister units working the freight yard in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The movie camera captures number 85 as it leads a classic ABBA lash-up, leaving Baton Rouge and heading towards New Orleans. The film was taken in December of 1966. This 35mm photograph was taken on the same day of the same train. It gives us an opportunity to get an up-close look at those first-generation covered wagons. These next two film clips, taken in 1966, show KCS freights being led by classic ABBA lash-ups. This photograph, taken in June of 1977 in DeQueen, Arkansas, shows number 76, coupled between two first-generation Jeeps on a northbound freight. In this final film clip in our F7 section, we see F7 number 85 at the head end of a 4-unit classic ABBA lash-up, heading a northbound freight out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Kansas City Southern was slow to realize the cost-saving flexibility inherent in road switcher design. An early experiment with American Locomotive Company RS-1s, delivered in 1943, as well as a later review of Fairbanks Morris H15-44 road switchers in 1949, had proven unsatisfactory. It wasn't until November of 1951 that the first of 13 GP7s were delivered. They were delivered in the black switcher paint scheme and were never used on over-the-road time freights. They were assigned to transfer runs and locals and were ideally suited for these assignments that included online switching. During the 1970s, the GP7s remaining on the roster, as well as all other motive power, were painted in the White Knight paint scheme. These next two photographs showed GP7 number 4159. It was one of the last GP7s in revenue service. It was retired on July 15, 1989. Jeep 7 number 4150 was taken out of service in June of 1987. After spending 2 years in storage, it was sold to the Central California Railway Museum along with the F3 and the F7. Battle-worn GP7 number 4160 is at Hope, Arkansas during June of 1993. Number 4160 is normally assigned to local freights between Hope and Shreveport. In this April of 1979 photograph, we see GP7 number 4154 idling in the Duramus yard. Number 4157 was assigned to DeQuincy, Louisiana for local service when this photograph was taken in July of 1978. Number 4161, also used on the local freights between Hope and Shreveport, is photographed in Hope, Arkansas in June of 1978. Still respectable-looking GP7 number 4153 sits in Hope during July of 1977. GP7s number 4154 and 4159 were assigned to the Mossville-Beaumont turn in the early 1980s. They are seen here in Beaumont, Texas. The last photograph in our GP7 series shows number 4156 in a fairly fresh paint job in Shreveport in June of 1981. Even though the GP9 was one of Electromotive's most popular models in the GP series, over 3,400 were built, the Kansas City Southern purchased only 3. They were numbered 4163 to 4165. In this photograph, we see Jeep 9 number 4164 with Jeep 7 4159 heading a freight through Beaumont, Texas in June of 1983. GP7 number 4162 was rebuilt to GP9 specifications in October of 1954. Number 4164 was the last of the GP9s on the active roster. It was taken out of service in July of 1989. In this photograph, we see it in DeQuincy, Louisiana in February of 1983. It was assigned to local freight service. The first road switchers that were purchased for over-the-road service and delivered in the then red road freight colors were 10 EMD second-generation GP30 road switchers. They joined the roster in 1962. The 2,250 horsepower GP30s, even with their original slipping problems, were a major success. Longer trains with higher tonnage became the norm. A second group of 10 joined the roster a year later in 1963. These units were partially paid for with the trade-in of 10 F3s. Even though the Kansas City Southern initiated an F3 upgrading program, 7 units were rebuilt to F7 specifications and 3 were revised to be the equivalent of F9s. The handwriting was on the wall. The conversion costs were prohibitive. The program was terminated and second-generation road switchers became the norm for all future road power. GP30 number 102 was renumbered 4102 prior to being repainted. We see it at Shreveport during April of 1979. A trio of GP30s lead train number 42 over the Mississippi River on the Huey Long Bridge in the film clip taken in 1967. Number 4101 is caught laying over in Hope, Arkansas in June of 1978. During the late 1980s, GP30s were assigned to the Mossville-Beaumont turn. In this June of 1986 photograph, we catch GP30s 4107 and 4117 passing through Beaumont. A pair of GP30s assigned to the Hope-Shreveport turn sit in Hope, Arkansas, waiting for their next assignment in a photograph taken in April of 1976. In this August of 1988 photograph, we see GP30 number 4117 leading train number 41 through Vidor, Texas. We see train number 42 arriving at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, led by GP30 number 115. The film clip was taken in 1967. Kansas City Southern added 12 2,000 horsepower GP38-2s to its roster between 1974 and 1978. 17 additional GP8-2s were purchased second-hand. 12 came from the Boston and Maine, 10 in 1989 and 2 more in 1990. 5 additional units were acquired from the Sioux Railroad, also in 1990, making a total of 29 GP38-2s on the roster. GP38-2 number 4005 sits in Doremus Yard in this July of 1977 photograph. A battle-worn pair of GP38-2 units sit at the Shreveport Engine Facility in March of 1986. GP38-2s handled the Mossport to Beaumont turn during the mid-1980s. In this photograph, we catch GP38-2 number 4008 entering Beaumont. Number 4009 brings train number 41 into Beaumont in September of 1985. GP38-2 number 4008 and a second-hand GP40 roll through Ashdown, Arkansas, with train number 82 during this September of 1988 film. There were 48 3,000 horsepower GP40s on the KCS roster, all purchased second-hand. 19 came from the Illinois Central Gulf in 1982, and the other 29 came from Conrail in 2 purchases, 17 in 1983 and 12 more in 1984. The ex-Conrail units were more flexible in assignments and operational locations, in that they were equipped with dynamic braking, which had not been needed on the Illinois Central Gulf. It was the acquisition of these locomotives that spelled the end for the first generation F3 and F7 covered wagons. In this June of 1991 photograph, we see GP40 number 772 at Shreveport, with renumbered GP40 number 4748. Number 784 received the stop sign logo. The former Illinois Central Gulf unit is at Shreveport in June of 1991. In this photograph, also taken in 1991, we see former number 753, now number 4753, at Shreveport. The dynamic brake gives away its Conrail heritage. Newly painted number 749 heads south out of the Chason yard in South Beaumont towards Port Arthur in this July of 1984 photograph. GP40 number 755 received an Operation Lifesaver logo when it was part of a joint Union Pacific Kansas City Southern Safety Special. It is seen here in Beaumont, Texas in August of 1986. In this October of 1985 photograph, we see number 762 and three other GP40s leading train number 2 down Gilbert Street in Beaumont, Texas. Former Illinois Central Gulf GP40, now Kansas City Southern number 784, leads train number 41 through downtown Beaumont, Texas in December of 1982. The KCS owned 4 GP40-2s. 2 were purchased in 1979 and the second 2 in 1981. The units operated in pairs with a road slug, either a former F7 or F3, between them. The locomotive sets were highly successful. Working on the southern end of the railroad, they were able to handle any assignments other than the coal unit trains. It was based on their success that the KCS went bargain hunting and purchased the second-hand GP40s. Number 799 with a companion slug lead the Mossville turn out of Beaumont, Texas during March of 1986. Number 797 idles at Shreveport in this July of 1983 SD40 locomotives were purchased by the Kansas City Southern in 4 sets during 1966 through 1971. 9 each were remote control masters or remote control slaves for mid-train use. In later years, the controls were removed. SD40 number 613 runs down Gilbert Street in Beaumont, Texas. Notice the black KCS letters rather than red. In this June of 1991 photograph, we see number 607, freshly painted, at Shreveport. As units were repainted, they also received the larger cab numbers. SD40 number 614 street runs down Railroad Avenue with train number 2. It will round the curve at Franklin Street and street run down Gilbert towards the Natchez River Bridge. In this April of 1976 photograph, we see class locomotive number 600 in South Beaumont, Texas, ready to depart with train number 41 for Port Arthur. Black lettered KCS number 608. Highballs through DeQueen, Arkansas. In this August of 1977 picture. The Kansas City Southern selected SD40 number 616 as one of their units that was going to be painted in a special paint job to celebrate the U.S. bicentennial. They conducted a grade school contest and ended up with what was known as the crayon scheme. SD40 number 619 passes through Nederland, Texas in December of 1975. The KCS had 41 SD40-2s on its roster, numbered 637 through 677. The first unit, number 637, delivered in February 1972, was the first SD40-2 delivered by Electromotive. A trio of SD40-2s is highballing through the I-10 overpass near Vidor, Texas. Almost new-looking number 660 is seen here heading northbound out of Shreveport in a July 1975 photograph. Number 666 has obviously been repainted with the large cab numbers. It's shown here in Beaumont Freight Yard sitting on the ready track in a February of 1990 photograph. On a cool, clear day in February 1985, we see SD40-2 number 671 at the head of train number 41, ready to depart the yard in Beaumont, Texas. In this December of 1979 photograph, we see Snoot Nose number 682 rolling southbound out of Beaumont, Texas, with train number 41 in tow. During the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Electromotive SD40-2s were the standard power for train number 41 out of Beaumont, Texas. In this February of 1983 photograph, we see number 683, also with a snoot nose, waiting for clearance to leave the yard. Recently delivered number 690 passes through downtown Beaumont in August of 1980. Here we see number 690, 10 years later, passing the old Kansas City Southern DeQuincy, Louisiana depot, which is now a museum. Number 642 also received the crayon paint scheme. The final photograph in the SD40-2 series shows number 692 rolling down Gilbert Street in Beaumont, Texas, with train number 2. The photograph was taken in 1984. Electromotive built 4 SD40X units for the Kansas City Southern. They were numbered 700 to 703. They were delivered in 1979. These units were the only SD40X units built and pioneered the SD50 3,500 horsepower power plant, but on an SD40-2 frame. Numbers 700 and 701 were remote-controlled masters, while numbers 702 and 703 were slaves. Class engine number 700 rolls through Ashdown, Arkansas in this June of 1990 photograph. Number 703 arrives in downtown Beaumont with train number 41 in August of 1988. The KCS acquired 10 ST-50 units in mid-1981. The 5 masters and 5 slaves were the last remote control units purchased. They were also the last new units acquired in the White Knight paint scheme. ST-50 number 704 is seen here in Beaumont, Texas in February of 1983. Number 709 still looks relatively new in this December of 1982 photograph. It was sitting on the ready tracks in the Beaumont freight yard and gives us an opportunity to get up close to an ST-50. Once again, we see train number 41 departing Beaumont, Texas. In this February of 1985 photograph, it has ST-50 number 711 on the point. In February of 1985, when this photograph was taken, ST-50s were common in the Beaumont, Texas area. Here we see number 712 on the point, again with train number 41. In our last photograph in the ST-50 as well as the over-the-road freight series, we see ST-50 number 708 waiting for the highball in the Beaumont, Texas freight yard. Following World War II, the nation's railroads began the wholesale conversion from steam to internal combustion. The Kansas City Southern would have preferred to stay with electromotive in its dieselization program, but orders at EMD were backed up and there was a 2-year waiting list for delivery. The KCS was operating with worn-out steam power, and rather than continue with the steam, they ordered a 4-unit set of Erie-built 2,000 horsepower units from Fairbanks Morris. They were available with a reasonable delivery time and joined the roster in 1946. 4 additional Erie-builts were added to the roster by 1948. The Kansas City Southern, like many railroads, experienced significant operational problems with the Fairbanks Morris opposed piston design prime mover. As a result, all but one of the Erie-builts was rebuilt by EMD. The conversions were basically unsuccessful, and by 1966, all of the Fairbanks Morris cab units were off of the roster. In May of 1952, the KCS acquired a pair of steam generator-equipped Fairbanks Morris 815-44 road switchers, numbered 40 and 41. The KCS experienced the same problems with the road switchers as they had with the Erie-builts. Number 40 was scrapped in 1964 after being operational for only 12 years. Number 41 was re-engined by EMD and remained active until 1971. Aside from a brief attempt at using adapted freight locomotives, the Kansas City Southern passenger operations were handled by Electromotive E-Series passenger locomotives. The first of the E-Series were three E3s purchased prior to World War II in 1938, 39, and 40. These were joined by two upgraded E6s in 1942. The next of the E-Series were four E8s purchased in 1952. The earlier E7 model didn't arrive until 1960. Two of the early E-Series locomotives were rebuilt after being involved in wrecks. In January of 1952, E3 number 23 was rebuilt into an E8. In June of 1959, E6 number 25 was rebuilt into an E9. The rebuilt locomotives were identified on the roster with a designation of the letter M for modified. Kansas City Southern had 5 E7 units on its roster. They were acquired from the Maine Central in October of 1963. In the following photographs and film clips, we see the E7s in action. In this June of 1967 photograph taken in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we see an E7 leading train number 10 on its way from Shreveport to New Orleans. There was little variation in passenger train operations on the Kansas City Southern during the time period of this DVD. Their flagship, the Southern Belle, operated daily between Kansas City and New Orleans. Full service was provided on this train. Another unnamed train, number 15-9 southbound and number 10-16 northbound, operated daily between Kansas City and the Gulf Coast cities of New Orleans and Port Arthur. The train was split at Shreveport. A third train operated between Hope, Arkansas and Shreveport until the early 1960s. It is interesting to note that this E7 has portholes rather than the more normal rectangular windows on the side. In this film clip, we see at the end of the train one of 4 ex-New York Central buffet lounge observation cars that the Kansas City Southern purchased in 1960. The KCS converted them to snack lounge observation cars. The KCS acquired 4 Electromotive E8s in 1952, numbered 26 to 29. Number 27 stayed on the roster long enough to receive the White Knight paint scheme. It was the last active E-unit in regular passenger service. And in January of 1970, it was sold to the Chicago Northwestern. The KCS continued to invest in passenger service throughout the early to mid-1960s, long after most other railroads were cutting back. As late as 1965, 10 new 72-seat coaches were purchased from the Pullman Standard Corporation. This was due in part to the fact that no competing interstate highways were being constructed or planned along the routes between Kansas City and the 2 Gulf Coast destinations. Passenger traffic was thought to be viable for some time. This proved to be false. The United States Post Office stopped moving mail by passenger trains during the late 1960s, and the Kansas City Southern ceased passenger train operations shortly later in 1969. In the following film clips, we see E8M number 23. It was rebuilt from the E3. Here we see E9M number 25. It was rebuilt from an E6 in June of 1959. In addition to the electromotive E-units for passenger service, the Kansas City Southern had two AB sets of electromotive F3s and two AB sets of electromotive F7s equipped with steam generators for passenger service. The F units were originally delivered in the handsome Southern Bell paint scheme. However, by the time this photograph was taken in December of 1967, they had been repainted for freight service. The now red and white F7s are at the head end of the Southern Bell running through Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Bell normally passed through Baton Rouge in the dark, but this morning it was running late and we caught it in the early morning sun. In this final film clip in our passenger section, we see an F7 and an F3B unit running high across the Mississippi River Bridge at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Southern acquired its first yard switcher in 1939, number 1100, an electromotive NW2. It was the first of 37 of these 1,000 horsepower units owned by the KCS. Yard switchers continued to be added to the roster until 1975. 16 electromotive 1,200 horsepower SW7s, 44 1,500 horsepower SW1500s, and 4 multiple-purpose versions of the SW1500s identified as MP15s. In addition to the electromotive switchers, the KCS had 4 high-hood Alco units purchased second-hand, 3 1,000 horsepower HH1000s acquired from the Manufacturers Railroad in St. Louis in 1954, and a single 900 horsepower HH900 purchased from the Youngstown and Northern Railroad in 1956. In addition to the high-hood Alco switchers, a single Alco S2 standard end-cab switcher was acquired in 1967. There are also 5 switchers from the Baldwin Locomotive Works, a single VO 660, and 4 S12s. The Kansas City Southern received electromotive NW2s in both the early and later car bodies. The later car body resembled the upgraded SW7. The easiest spotting difference between the NW2 and the SW7 was that the NW2s had a half front radiator, whereas the SW7s had a full front radiator. In this January of 1968 photograph, we see a recently repainted NW2, number 1205, working in New Orleans yard. A later car body NW2, number 1226, is seen in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in January of 1967. In this April of 1977 photograph, we see renumbered NW2, now carrying number 4206, still in the red paint, as it switches a chemical plant in Port Neches, Texas. Battle-worn NW2 number 4224 is seen here in Beaumont, Texas in June of 1976. Number 4125 is one of the early model NW2s, former Louisiana and Arkansas number 1125. It now wears KCS number 4125. We see it here in DeQueen, Arkansas in this August of 1977 photograph. Freshly painted NW2 number 4223 is seen here in Beaumont, Texas in October of 1976. NW2 number 1223 was working Texarkana, Texas when this movie was taken in April of 1969. The Kansas City Southern had 16 SW7s on the roster, purchased between October of 1950 and January of 1951. As indicated, the SW7 models can be identified by the large radiator grille. Renumbered SW7 number 4308 is still in its as-delivered paint scheme as it works in Shreveport in June of 1977. In this August of 1981 photograph, we again see number 4308. It has been repainted and now wears the white livery. Number 1314, still in red, is seen here in Beaumont, Texas in December of 1970. Number 4313 sits at the Beaumont Yard Engine Facility during October of 1976. Number 4315 received the large cab number when it was repainted. Battle-worn 1301, still in the black paint scheme, is seen at the Shreveport shops. Number 1300 was the first SW7 to join the Kansas City roster. It was delivered on October 28, 1950. A pair of SW7s that were used as pushers to get train number 42 over the Mississippi River Bridge returned to Baton Rouge in this 1967 movie. The SW1500 units were originally numbered in the 1500 series, starting with the number 1500. In the early 1970s, they were renumbered into the 4300 series, starting at 4320, behind the renumbered SW7s. Some of the SW1500s were equipped as slug mothers. SW1500, number 1502, was only a year old when it was filmed in early 1968. Slug mother number 4329, now with a large cab number, works the Beaumont, Texas yard. Number 1 is an ex-Howell coal unit. It was leased to a rail-water coal export operator at Port Arthur when this shot was taken in April of 1977. Ex-Howell Coal number 2, now KCS number 4362, is in Beaumont, Texas in May of 1981. Here we see number 1502 working the Shreveport Yard in this January of 1968 photograph. KCS still had a small yard in downtown Lake Charles when number 4357 was filmed in 1976. This yard was shut down shortly thereafter when the bridge between Westlake and Lake Charles was destroyed and operations were moved to Mossville. Number 4325 is seen here in Beaumont, Texas in March of 1984. A pair of SW-1500s idle at the Beaumont engine facilities in February of 1985. The Kansas City Southern's 4 MP-15s were received after the renumbering program and were numbered 4363 to 4366 following the SW-1500s. All 4 were equipped as slug mothers. In these next 2 photographs taken in 1977, we see almost new number 4366 working the yard in Heavener, Oklahoma. Years later, we again see number 4366. This time it's at Beaumont, Texas. It now wears a large cab number. In this film clip, taken in 1968, we see High Hood Alco number 1123 sitting outside the Electromotive LaGrange, Illinois plant. It was a trade-in. The trade-in tracks at the Electromotive LaGrange plant were a favorite location for Midwestern rail fans. They provided an opportunity to see locomotives from all across the nation. The KCS acquired their only Alco S2 yard switcher second-hand in 1964 from the Kansas City Terminal Railroad. It was renumbered 1114 and was one of the early units painted white. In 1968, it was sold to a construction company. In this photograph, we see it at Kansas City prior to purchase. The KCS RS-1 units were numbered 1110 to 1113 and were assigned to the northern portion of the system. In this photograph, taken in September of 1965, we catch number 1113 at Kansas City working the joint Milwaukee Road, Kansas City yard. The 4 Baldwin S12s, numbered 1160 to 1163, spent most of their lives working in Kansas City. In these last 2 photographs in our Yard Switcher series, we see Baldwin's number 1162 and 1163 working in the Kansas City yard in September of 1965. As we approach the second decade of the 21st century, most of the over-the-road locomotives reviewed in this film are no longer on the KCS roster. While it's still possible to see SD40-2s and SD50s, and others of their more modern locomotives, most of the KCS freights are now hauled behind General Electric ES44ACs or Electromotive SD70 Max or SD70 ACEs. However, for many years, it was possible to see examples of Kansas City Southern's earlier diesels still in operation on other railroads, and a number are still in revenue service in 2009 when this film was created. While most of the early diesels were either scrapped or traded in for newer power, a number were sold to other railroads and remained in operation long after being removed from the KCS roster. The following photographs illustrate a number of these former KCS diesels working for their new owners. These first two photographs, taken in June of 1991, show a couple of former first-generation diesels in revenue service. SL1, former KCS slug number 4055, and 705, former KCS GP7 number 4156, are seen here working for the Kiamichi Railroad in Hugo, Oklahoma. In this August of 1988 photograph, we see Sioux Line ST40 number 6400, former KCS number 622, still in white paint at Bensonville, Illinois. 8 years later, in a photograph taken in November of 1996 in Holland, Michigan, we again see number 6400, now wearing the colors of the Canadian Pacific. Our final example of a Kansas City Southern locomotive working for a new owner is former KCS NW2 number 1102. It's far away from home in Mankato, Minnesota, working for the Chicago Northwestern in this June of 1978 photograph. A review of the Kansas City Southern's early diesels would not be complete without at least a few photographs of the KCS modern-day Southern Belle. The Southern Belle is a Kansas City Southern business train pulled by rebuilt FP9s purchased from Via in Canada in the mid-1990s. The reborn Southern Belle is undoubtedly a handsome ambassador of goodwill for the Kansas City Southern. While its first-generation diesels and their successors have faded into American rail history, the Kansas City Southern has evolved into one of America's successful mega railroads. In these three photographs, we see examples of the KCS NAFTA routes. Because of NAFTA, the KCS future seems bright, and there is good reason to believe that the railroad will continue to grow and prosper. As the years pass, the current General Electric and electromotive superpower will undoubtedly be replaced by newer and more efficient locomotives. A new generation of rail fans will look back at them the same way those of us with gray hair and Medicare cards in our wallets remembered the covered wagons, the Erie Bilts, and the 1,000 horsepower road switchers.